All
All
right,
right,
welcome to November 2020 Tech Conference. And we're going to start our first talk here. We have Allan Wintersieck, CTO of Devotry, is going to tell us about, do you really need Agile? Which I'm sure there'll be no opinions on. So we'll have a very boring discussion afterward. Probably not the case. Should be an exciting presentation and I am sure a robust discussion. So with that, take it away, Allan.
Awesome. Let me figure out how to share my screen. All right, do you all see that?
Sure do.
Great.
Yes.
Cool. So we can dive on in. So yeah, talk is called "Do You Really Need Agile?" And then I decided to sort of diffuse it by immediately having a subtitle of "Probably You Do." So the goal here really is just kind of think through all of this. I've had on my mind recently, just kind of thinking about things and critically thinking about them, even if they're things you use all the time and you generally believe in. I feel like it's important to kind of think through them and think if there's any improvements and things like that. So that's kind of the goal here, and then definitely looking forward to discussion and opinions afterward. So first off, this is me. I'm Allan Wintersieck. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Devotry, as Gabe said. We're a software consulting company here in Denver, about 40 people or so, been around for 6 years, something like that. Here's my amazing dog on the right, because I thought about putting a picture of myself, and then I was like, well, I'm going to be on video, so what's the point? Cool. So diving in, the goal here really is we work with a whole lot of different companies that use a whole lot of different processes consistently at being a consulting company. And what we see a lot is that there are plenty of things that work and there are plenty of things that could use improvement in different teams. But oftentimes it's somewhat unrelated to like the underlying process that they're trying to follow. It's rarely like, oh, the people that use Scrum definitely always succeed and the people that don't. It's never that. It's much more kind of different things seem to work better for different situations and different teams and different personalities. So that's what got me thinking about this more. It's just kind of thinking through what is that difference and what kind of different things can we look out for, challenges can we see to improve on as time goes on. Most organizations, probably almost all of them that we partner with, use some flavor of Agile. I think almost always Scrum, generally speaking, or some kind of loose interpretation of it. I thought this chart from State of Agile report is kind of interesting in that the vast majority of people that say they use Agile, few people are confident in saying that they use it kind of perfectly, quote unquote, which matches my my experience for sure. That there's a lot of people that are following some sort of general process that's kind of like that, but few people seem to kind of like really adhere to something exact and strict, which is probably a good thing. Usually from what we see anyway, it's very often some sort of kind of loose interpretation of Scrum, mainly especially these kind of radial charts on the bottom here. This is definitely what I've seen, which is that everyone does kind of daily stand-ups and retros and 2-week sprints. But usually the exact way that all of that goes together kind of changes a bit depending on the organization. But that seems to be usually the kind of consistent factor. It almost always seems to be 2-week sprints too. I don't know how we all landed on that, but apparently we did somehow. We see Kanban a little bit occasionally, but for the most part, it's much more kind of a sprint-based kind of agile thing is what we see a lot of the time. Yeah, I feel like this is important to kind of talk about. This is not at all intended to be a kind of quote unquote anti-agile talk. I wrote an article about this and got a little heat of that from people on that, on thinking, oh no, agile is amazing. I generally agree. I think agile is good. I also think it's really important to kind of think through things and always be thinking about ways to improve and what actually works well for your specific team and people and project and all of that kind of thing, rather than just blindly following the thing that everyone thinks is the right way to go. So that's the goal here, is just think about it consistently, no matter what. I think it's also interesting to look at the Agile Manifesto. I try to kind of reread it every couple of years because it's interesting to me how much we kind of, distorted might be a strong word, but we definitely sort of drift around and away from a lot of these principles. Some organizations that are doing much more kind of capital A agile strict process are like pretty far away from a couple of these original Agile Manifesto tenets, in my opinion, which that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is interesting that it's it means a whole lot of things to a lot of different people now, and it's a little bit sort of overused as a term. Yeah, so the general theory here is let's just kind of go on a thought exercise journey together. This is what I've been thinking about myself, which is just kind of how did we get here and what could we possibly improve on and why does Agile generally work and what doesn't work about it. So with that in mind, kind of go through a thought process. So the first thought in my mind was the most efficient way to build something, not in the software industry, but just in a general sense, is to plan out what needs to be built, figure out who needs to do what part and in what order, and then build that thing. I have a nice picture of a waterfall to demonstrate my point here. So this, I think, is pretty much how most things happen still in the world. And it's the most sort of intuitive and logical way to approach anything, which is just make a plan and then follow that plan and build that thing. Like I said, this is definitely the way that most everything in the world, I think, is still built outside of the software industry. I have a friend that runs IT for a commercial construction company, and he was marveling at the fact that like they use some agile stuff inside their IT organization, but the construction company overall is so incredibly dialed into a more traditional kind of project management approach because it just has to be, because that's how kind of construction works. I toured like a job site once with him, which is really interesting. And they had the project managers there. It was a 1.5 year long project of commercial construction down in downtown Denver. And they had every day, they had it planned out to exactly what they're going to have done every single day for a 1.5 years, because the penalties for being late started the day after the due date for the whole building to be done. So it was just completely perfectly planned all the way through. And I'm sure in reality, of course, there's plenty of challenges with that too. But it's fascinating to see that kind of approach in contrast to the usual kind of technology way that we are used to seeing things. So yeah, I think part of that comes from Agile is really not particularly intuitive as a concept in a general sense. And what I mean by that is if people outside of all the software industry and all of the kind of understanding and seeing different ways to do this, it would feel like a very weird way to do something, to just sort of kind of do any sort of, rebuild things, reiterate on things, stuff like that all the time, instead of just planning out and doing it quote unquote correctly from the get-go. And I think that's probably the most interesting thing I thought about with Agile. So why does it work? And so this is where I really got to thinking more and more is if that is the case, if that is kind of the default way of building things, this more traditional approach, then why does Agile, generally speaking, work? Because we've been doing it for a couple decades, whatever. And there's a lot of studies and a lot of experiences from a lot of people that it does generally seem to work somewhat better than alternatives usually. So why is that? And so I got to thinking down this kind of path. And I think the answer is that if we theoretically, as technology leaders, theoretically perfectly did everything using this traditional approach, then I think it would be cheaper than Agile. It's just that that is effectively impossible to actually accomplish in our industry. And so this list of kind of bullets of things that make that difficult, I'm sure could be a whole lot longer, but the things that came to my mind are there's a lot more variables in our industry. Let me just move the camera thing. There's a lot more variables in how we build things compared to more established industries. So for example, my wife and I are having a house built right now, that's a whole, I could do a talk on that topic. That's a whole thing. But what we've seen with that is that it's very much the traditional approach. We have an architect that makes all the exact plans. We get all the permits together. Everything completely aligns on everything. And what I've noticed through that process is that the variables involved are significantly less. And I'm sure construction folks would probably tell me there are still plenty of variables, I'm sure. But think about, if you're building, you already have a plot of land, you already know pretty much what you're going to put onto it. You already know all of the rules and the building codes about how things have to be done. So for example, we got a soil report on what kind of soil we have. And then our structural engineer compared that to the building code and said, well, this is the foundation that you have to build. And there's just one option because that's what you have to do for the soil. And that's what you have to do in that particular city. Compare that to software, the amount of ways that you could possibly architect even a pretty straightforward sort of CRUD software application is, almost infinite. And so it's that kind of thing. There's just so many different things and ways to approach things still in our industry, which maybe somewhat is related to how it's younger as an industry than a lot of others. But somewhat, I think it's just related that it moves quicker and it's more sort of flexible and all of that kind of thing. So it ends up being that way. The second bullet, everything changes around us frequently. I think that's kind of external kind of variations is also very much higher for our industry in general. So consider same kind of construction example. Say someone's building an apartment building and they get halfway done building it. They're probably not going to really change direction. So even if they see like, oh, maybe some competitor started building an apartment building across the street that they didn't entirely know was going to happen. Well, the housing market is sort of overall set enough. They probably expected that enough, and they spent enough money up front that they're not going to change anything about what they're doing most of the time. They're just going to keep kind of trucking along. Whereas for us, if you're halfway through building a startup product or something like that, and then Google comes out with a direct competitor to it, then you're probably going to make a pretty drastic immediate change because you can, and because things move kind of quicker and more differently in this industry. And that last third bullet is the kind of because you can part is, I think, just the fact that you can consistently make changes and kind of and change direction to some extent is sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. That means that you will. So if you have stakeholders that know it's possible and they don't see a concrete slab in front of them in a very physical sense, then they're going to come with requirements changes and changes in direction and all of that kind of stuff because we can. And that's not a bad thing. Sometimes that's for very good reason. And that's why Agile works, but it is just kind of is what it is. It goes that direction. So overall, what I landed on is that Agile is somewhat costly because there's all these ceremonies and all these things and all this iteration that costs. It's just that it usually is still less costly than any alternative that we've kind of come up with so far. So what specifically kind of can go wrong? I think a lot of organizations seem to approach it as the default approach is, well, we're just going to do some sort of 2-week sprint agile approach. And that's sort of the free way of doing it. There's no cost to doing it that way because that's the way everybody does it. And I think that's not quite correct. I think agile does have costs, and you have to understand what these costs are actually getting for you and what these are achieving and how these are helping you in order to understand kind of how to mold it to your organization and your team to make sure that it's actually giving you value. Whereas some people just sort of dive right into all of the processes of a kind of loose Scrum approach without understanding any of that. And then they're paying the cost, but not necessarily getting the benefit. I've considered all of it. I'll go through a bunch of specific things that we've seen a lot with different clients and different projects. And then it'd be awesome to hear from other folks about what they've seen for sure. I think a whole lot of these, maybe all of these, I don't think the solution is in any way abandon agile or anything like that. I think it's really look at what it's getting you and what it's costing you, and then figure out how to tweak all of that to make sure you're getting the value out of it. I also, it's worth mentioning, I think that some of these are pretty much more related to Scrum iteration sprint kind of thing than more of a loose lowercase agile approach. Okay, so diving into some specific things. So this is kind of the default in my mind, which is iteration cost is too high. I think this is why most things in the physical world don't use some sort of agile approach. And it's why there are some situations where you kind of have to understand what that iteration cost is in the software world as well for the same kind of reason. So what usually I've seen is that your typical kind of SaaS product company, CRUD, backend, all of that kind of stuff, your iteration cost is probably pretty low because you're doing kind of the same thing that a lot of people are doing. It's pretty well defined and nothing's so complicated in terms of your architecture that it's not too hard to change anything and change directions and tweak things. But when you start to get into hardware stuff or IoT or things like that, you can start to edge into a world where that iteration cost starts to go up. And then you have to consider what are you getting from kind of your ability to iterate and where is that return on investment line landing? Because you might get to a point where the cost is so high to iterate that you should do more planning up front to sort of offset that cost. And again, I don't think that means, oh, let's plan for months and write a big PRD, but it does maybe mean let's think about things a little bit more before we just blindly dive in and iterate over and over on everything. I think also sometimes this can just be an internal thing. I've seen plenty of larger or older organizations where even if one team inside of it's trying to be agile, it takes so long to get everything, all the access, stuff like that from everywhere else in the organization that any sort of change in direction can take a long time anyway, even with the best of intent. Second, this is what we kind of jokingly call Watergile internally, where people are basically waterfall, but they want to call it agile. We see this maybe the most often in terms of projects that we end up doing. And it's really where people already know pretty much everything that they want to have accomplished in some sort of period of time. And they're not really planning on getting any sort of feedback or changing things or having any iteration. But they know that agile is kind of the way to do it. So therefore they kind of break all of this basically waterfall process up into an agile process, which adds all the sort of agile overhead on top of something that more or less is just sort of waterfall anyway. I think the way I think about this is it's pretty common and totally reasonable to not have any kind of external learnings for a while, meaning if you're just building a new product or a new feature, you might not demo it to clients or really learn things from users directly for a little while. And that's usually all right. I think sometimes people could do that better and learn things sooner, but generally there's plenty of cases for that. But if that is the case, I think you've got to make sure that you're getting the internal benefit. Because if you're just making an enormous plan up front and just telling a team to do everything that's in that plan without any sort of consideration or talking to internal stakeholders or anything like that, then you're basically just doing waterfall with a bunch of extra steps. But if you take all that and really embrace actually learning and actually improving as a team and embracing all of that process, even if it's still internal only, you can still get plenty of benefit from all of this without kind of, all of the downside. I think what we've seen a lot too is on the shorter or kind of more defined projects like this, something a little more Kanban style where it's just one consistent Kanban board that you work through can help, because that cuts down a bit of the overhead and process without cutting down all of the sort of agile benefits. So next up, we see this quite often too, as agile as an excuse to change direction all the time. So I've seen this both at Devotry currently and at product companies in the past that I've worked at, where if your leadership doesn't kind of have the experience they maybe need, they can end up in a situation where they use agile just as this sort of crutch to allow them to constantly quote unquote pivot and do different things all the time without ever actually like getting proper feedback and real data from the market at any given point in time. This is, I think, probably one of the most dangerous ways that agile gets sort of distorted into something. You can end up just really spinning in a circle and building a bunch of different things without ever getting far enough with any of those things to actually learn from the market and understand what you're doing and whether it actually is working. And this that can really just end up in a kind of endless circle of spending money and engineering resources without really getting anywhere. This is kind of just a different take on the same thing, chasing perfection. So same kind of idea, but instead of constantly trying new features and new directions and things like that, we've seen teams that are constantly kind of thinking, oh, this is just not good enough for the MVP. So they just keep trying to make it better and better and better because they're like, oh, if we show the market now, it will have some negative reaction and we only get one chance or some sort of idea along those lines. And instead, they need to just sort of draw some sort of line in the sand and understand what is a real MVP and then get out there and actually get external feedback. I think I see this a lot. In my opinion, it seems to come sometimes from that kind of like a place of fear where especially newer startup CEOs or product folks, they get into this vibe of they make all these theoretical, hypothetical decisions and everything's peachy as long as it's all in an internal iteration workflow because you don't have to kind of face any of the actual feedback for your decisions. But as soon as you take an MVP to the market, then all of the money you spent, all of the funding that you have becomes very real immediately because it either works or it doesn't work. And that obviously means you can kind of be afraid of that process. So you can end up in this thing where you're avoiding the inevitable process of actually getting real market feedback. Next, very strict and rigid agile process. I probably should have made it a capital A, agile, in this issue. But I think this one's a little contentious that there's some good reasons that this is sometimes the case for sure. I think there's also some bad reasons. I think the best reason almost certainly is regulations and compliance. We've had customers that, they're FDA regulated because they're making, devices, medical devices, things like that. In situations like that, there's just no way around it. You have to have a huge amount of process because safety is a concern, all that kind of stuff. And it is what it is. It takes longer and there's more overhead, but all of your competitors have the same concern. So that's all fine. I think also number two, to large enterprise organizations, this can be something to, I think the larger an organization gets, the more kind of process and overhead you need in general. But that's always a fine line of balancing how much do you need and how much is helping you versus what's just turning you into kind of that bureaucratic enterprise organization that we've all experienced. I think the most common bad reason for this is that oftentimes companies they're not really actually trying to be agile as an organization overall, but maybe some little slice of them is, like some software team inside of it. And then you get in this flow where if all of your business stakeholders and all the people that are trying to hold a software team accountable, if they're all expecting you to basically make a plan and then set a firm date and then meet all of these commitments, then even if you do kind of quote unquote agile internal to your team, there might be some benefit, but in reality, what you're doing is pretty much still just an overall waterfall process, because that's what everything is kind of expecting in reality. This is tough because there are good cases where you can do an agile process inside of a team, even if the overall organization doesn't work that way. But you can also end up in this sort of flow where you end up with incredibly strict, quote unquote, agile that really more or less just ends up being more kind of waterfall-y than anything else. Next up, you can't actually be retrospective. This is, I think, one of the worst ones to deal with on a personal level. We see this sometimes with clients that maybe aren't the best organizations in the world, and it's where a lot of the problems and the things you actually need to solve are pretty much entirely outside of the team's control. And then any retros end up just sort of being complaining sessions about the problems that you have to deal with and the fact that you can't fix them. And it's kind of tough. At the end of the day, like if it truly is that bad and it's truly unsolvable, then, well, probably just need to figure out a different situation, or for us, like fire a client or whatever. But I think there's also some ways that you can figure that out internally, at least for a while, where you set kind of ground rules in terms of, we know these are concerns, we know we can't fix them right now. Let's focus on the things that we actually can be retrospective about and actually can fix, to avoid that sort of culture hit morale issue of just kind of endlessly complaining about things. Lastly, maybe, I can't remember, pretty close to lastly, agile, because it's what the cool kids do. We see this sometimes too, and it's just kind of a catch-all that agile is such the sort of hyped up thing that even people that don't really know anything about what it's trying to accomplish or what the benefits could be are trying to do some flavor of it. And that, in my opinion, this is sort of a positive, because it almost always means their heart is in the right place and they just need some help and coaching, and it can grow and figure out what the actual kind of way to proceed is. So not really a negative thing, but I definitely have seen this plenty of people that are, attached to the idea of doing agile rather than actually understanding what any of it really means. Cool. All right. Conclusion. So this is kind of a catch-all, but building software is complicated and nothing magically fixes all of it, I think, is the overall conclusion that I came to. Cool. I think that's about it for me. This is my contact info. I would totally love to discuss all of this and hear other thoughts. And then here's a picture of my dog in a deck chair, because yeah, she loves to sit in the deck chair.
Great. Because we're going to have a whole discussion, let's hold off on the Q&A that we normally do for a moment. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.